It's 2022, and today I'm going to tell you why every American should be able to vote. When I say everyone, I mean it. Non-citizen residents, the mentally incapacitated, felons, minors as young as 0, and pig-loving literate spiders. As long as someone lives here and wants to vote, they should be able to. This is, of course, a laughable proposition. As a person who is probably not insane, I do not think it would be particularly judicious for schizophrenic babies or guerrilla terrorists to cast ballots that will affect all of us. Then why do I believe that they and every other resident of this country should be able to? The reason is actually very simple. Of course, there are multiple factors for each group that I would give franchise to, but the crux of the matter is that I don't know. And neither do you. And neither does anybody. Nobody knows anything, but everybody might. I'm sure that sufficiently gets my point across, but just in case, I'll explain further. Government, in its most unadulterated form, is the instrument by which society accomplishes tasks for the common good that individuals cannot easily do themselves or through the economy. This can include things like road construction, healthcare, welfare, defense, policing, finding the turkeys that escape the inherent depravity of their species and are not deserving of summary execution, and coining money. But who decides all this? Who gets to choose what laws are enforced and how much we spend on various programs? History has answered this question in a number of ways, from the absolute monarchies of ancient Egypt and Brunei to the representative democracies we are more familiar with today, like Malawi. Most people have a sense that the latter is the right way to go, but it is worth taking a look at the underlying idea of it all. To quote the caption on the Snapchat Donald Trump sent to Mike Pence last January after clicking through a 36-page PowerPoint presentation on how to overturn the 2020 election, why do we even need democracy in the first place? At first glance, this question may appear important, rich, and relevant. And it is. Sometimes things are nice like that. Let's start simple. By definition, we ought to do what is best. While a sizable, albeit decreasing, number of people think that democracy chooses the best policies, it does not take much creativity to imagine something better. Let us imagine some sort of hypothetical perfect governing machine that I'll call the genius executive bureaucrat. Present Jeb with any situation, and it will always find the ideal course of action. Even if we conceive of Jeb as infallible, there is one fundamental question it cannot answer, a question so central to the human experience that we ask it over and over, even if the answers we receive are usually quite limited. What is this question? To quote the General Conference on Weights and Measures deciding the unit of power, what's good? Without an answer to this question, even the almighty Jeb is rendered impotent. It is impossible to even try to do what is best without having an idea of what best is. Now, you may be thinking, if this hypothetical Jeb mechanism is so smart, why wouldn't it know what good is? First off, that's a bit rude. Secondly, Jeb represents the theoretical maximum of what can be definitively known, the objective, the rational, the scientific, but the original moral question evades answering as such. Yes, Jeb can tell us which distributive policy causes the most economic stability, which vaccination rule saves the most lives, which interstate route is least impactful on the environment, which model of multi-million-dollar fighter jet leads to the secretion of the most kilograms of dopamine. All questions that have correct and discoverable answers. But it can't tell us which golds to prioritize, or even which gold ought to be gold in the first place, without relying on some other moral idea. Allowing it to find the answer to the moral question would essentially define Jeb as God, and resolving our problem with a literal deus ex machina is simply bad writing. So what now? In order to let Jeb function, we have to give it some moral framework to work off of. One critical thing to reiterate here is that moral truth cannot really be accessed in any objective way. So whether this framework is something Jeb somehow chooses for itself, or one of our own, it is going to be groundless and at least a little arbitrary. At this point you might be thinking, if nobody can know what good is, or even that it is, why do we need to worry about choosing the wrong right? Well, the trouble is we are not completely ignorant about goodness, so we must compare apples and oranges. I like apples more. With this, I can say that apples are better, not in a universal sense, but better for me. While this moral judgment is personal and limited, it is not meaningless. In fact, it is categorically true. Unless I'm concealing my scandalous predilection for oranges like a county supervisor up for election in central Washington, when I tell you that apples are better for me, you can't tell me I'm wrong. Sure, you can respond that oranges are better for my health or for my budget, but those claims aren't actually moral. They're just stating facts. that oranges have more vitamin C that boosts immunity, and they're cheaper than apples. But feelings don't have to care about facts. Whether or not health or money or anything else is good is fundamentally an assumption that we make. These personal judgments are the only way that we have any idea of what is right. At this point you might be thinking, surely morality comes from something more than mere assumptions. Granted, our moral views do not come from nowhere. Many borrow ideas from the media and the people around them. Some adopt a prepackaged morality from a particular tradition, religion, or political ideology. Few attempt to cleverly reason out their own, and most combine all of the above sources into something new entirely. Regardless of how they were formed, we have all personally made whichever assumptions underlie our particular ideas of right. Though some of these individual moral sensibilities may be more general or less complex than others, we still cannot say that any are objectively more correct. At this point, you might be thinking about the 2006 epic crime thriller The Departed. I don't see why you would. So we have a bunch of true but conflicting personal ideas of what is best, and no solid idea of what is best in general. What now? Is the dream of Jeb dead in the water like a poor man on the Titanic? Well, it wouldn't make much sense to throw our hands up and become anarchists. After all, we're pretty darn sure murder is bad, and surely we ought to consider that general judgment actionable, even if a few might seem to disagree. I sincerely hope that that conclusion is obvious, but it's worthwhile to think about the exact reason why we may trust it. Consensus is the key here, and this is what voting allows us to do, to look at all the unprovable assumptions we hold and declare the most universal ones as our best guess at moral truth. Once we have a collective moral standard, we can feed it to something like Jeb and get the ideal valid government. What would this moral standard be like? Of course, our morality is not really straightforward enough to be distilled to a few rules and rights. While there are a number of moral standards that most of us would claim to support, life, freedom, equality, and so on, it does not take much creativity to think of situations where we would be uncomfortable with the ramifications of following any of them as absolute rules, say, extreme wealth redistribution or paying murderers not to murder as much. This doesn't mean that our morals are contradictory, just that they have some texture, even if we may struggle to describe it perfectly. So instead of mindlessly following a couple overstated moral judgments, we would probably want a number of more detailed laws that better reflect what we actually feel is right. Since this takes effort, we'd probably want to regularly choose some people to come up with the laws and assign some others to make sure that they are enforced in ways that we're okay with. Hey, what do you know? That's more or less what we have. Isn't that convenient? As long as the original principles of the government are grounded in popular support, the government can be valid. Now, keep in mind that the result of democracy is still probably just a guess. Even if we disregard the idea that there is some external objectively correct morality somewhere out there, it is not clear which way we ought to combine the various individual perspectives to get our best estimation of moral truth. Besides questions of election systems and access, there are many people who think that some voices should count more, especially on particular issues. Women on abortion, taxpayers on tax rates, humans on slaughterhouse regulations. These perspectives can sound reasonable, and it may be tempting to agree with them, but there is an unavoidable issue with excluding some in the process of democracy. It's not about fairness or equality or anything like that. Those are neither absolutes nor givens, but about what we need democracy for in the first place. The reason why we cannot exclude anyone from voting is the reason why we need voting. Democracy is what lets us turn the individual ideas of what's right into a workable idea of moral truth. As such, we cannot operate on an assumption about who should be able to vote without first confirming that assumption by voting. Voting is foundational in this sense, so everyone has to be eligible to vote. We don't really have the choice. So that's it. That's why everyone should be able to vote, in all too many words. Or at least, this is why everyone should be able to vote, in theory. Granted, this is more or less enough to make me support practical implementation, and perhaps it's enough to convince you, but this argument requires that you think you don't actually know anything before you think that everyone should be able to vote, and most people are wise enough to demand some greater reasons for actually doing things than vague abstractions. So am I saying that the government is illegitimate because about half of diaper users are ineligible to vote? Well, yes, but that's not really the point here. What I hope all this accomplishes is to conceptualize suffrage not as the right we say it is, and certainly not as the entitlement we treat it as, but rather as more of a purpose default. So, of course, I don't expect any of this to convince you that horses or newborns, or the people that steal them should be able to vote. No, that's a task for part 2. With that, Thank you for watching, and
Please clap.